Thank you, Dr. Heba, for your enlightening speech. I must admit there is quite a few gems there that I didn't have an opportunity to come across before. Just a few words in sum before we invite Dr. Kessler to intervene and respond to the speech from Dr. Heba. As a signature conclusion from this speech is that our modern Muslim societies are not sincerely secular, and that our governments and our secularism is more than happy to live with a religion and ulama that actually promote obedience. So with this, I pass the floor to Professor Kessler.
Look, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here again and to be invited, even invited back after being naughty in the past, by the IRF. Let me begin responding to Dr. Heba by saying, as an anthropologist and sociologist, yes, I know about the great mea culpas of Brian Turner, of Peter Berger, but I don't offer any such mea culpa myself. The chair mentioned that I've been studying things in Malaysia now for over 50 years. When I began, some years before I first came here in the mid-1960s, wondering about what was going on in Kelantan, where 2 years after independence, a political party calling itself Islamic had swept to power in the state in defiance of rejecting the new Malayan federal government, winning 28 out of 30 seats in the state assembly. And what I wondered was going on there. People who studied political science and studied India, South Asia in those days, said, what is it in Kerala? Communists win power through elections. And similarly, the question was posed, what is going on in Kelantan or places like Kelantan? And it turns out that when the Islamic Party PAS won state power in Kelantan in 1959, it was the first time that an Islamist political force, a political party, had won a modern democratic election and come to power by those procedures certainly in the post-colonial or ex-colonial world. Well, some of us wondered about why that was so, and I was one of them. And I wanted to look at what was going on there, and I thought anthropology might be a very nice way to do it. Sit in a village, see what this means on the ground, see how this fits into society and culture. Of course, Dr. Heba is right, that if you tried to do this in anthropology and sociology those days, you were definitely swimming against the current. People took the view that, as modernization theory put it in those days, modernity was an acid that dissolved tradition. There was no part of the social world that was more traditional than religion, and there was no religion that was more traditional than Islam. So Islam was just, it was not a case of the withering away of the state, but the withering away of a state of faith. That was the view. A very famous book at the time, which Dr. Heba called, was Daniel Lerner's The Passing of Traditional Society in the Middle East. It was waning away, it was dissolving, it was almost a talqin, it was almost a eulogy. Well, I didn't think that was so. And I started writing, it was far more primitive in those days, but writing one-paragraph research proposals. You didn't have to write big grant applications in those days, saying that I didn't think that religion was waning in the world, I didn't think that Islam was waning away, and that I thought that Islam might have a future, might be developing as a force, as a basis, as an ideology, as a resource, as a force of resistance against advancing imposed modernization and modernity. Well, people didn't want to hear this, it's true. But nevertheless, I'm a stubborn, well, I don't want to use that word, I'm a stubborn buzzard, and I kept on with my work. Second part of my preliminary is to say yes. When I was teaching in New York in throughout the 70s, and I had a good colleague in New York in 1979 who was a very committed Marxist and who was on the editorial board of a very politically correct, progressive Marxist newspaper in New York. And when the Iranian Revolution came around, she said, well, we'd been talking about those things for a long time. She said, you really ought to write something. And I said, all right. So I wrote. I don't have a copy of it anymore. I threw it away. Somebody can do a research on it, can dig it up in the New York Guardian, of whoever the Guardian was published by, whether they were the Communist Party or the Trots, I can't remember anymore, in which I said, funny thing, you guys, here it is, you've been overtaken. You've got a revolution, and it's not the revolution you expected. So some of us at least worried about those things. Okay. Having said that, I say this not to boast or offer credentials, but simply to contextualize what I'm saying and who it is that's saying and who speaks here. Now, there are many things to talk about. I'm not going to give a long theoretical, philosophical commentary. I do want to respond to all the issues that Dr. Heba raises because I think they're important. I'll do it in my own senior citizen, overburdened, modest kind of way, simply by saying that there are a couple of books that I've been looking at, trying to think about lately, and I want to do a little show and tell, just like in primary school, to show you the books and to say why they again interest me. Now, one is a little book called The Reformation, a short introduction in this. It's the Oxford Short Introduction series, which I've had lying around, and I dipped into it for a while, but I then sat down and read it again recently. Now, well, I won't say just as, because then I'll get into a very complicated sentence. It has always struck me as being ironic and profoundly interesting that the core basic ideas of modern secular political ideology, this radical commitment to the inherent philosophy of the ontology, the equality of all human beings, is an idea that first entered human history and first entered human consciousness in a religious form and under religious auspices. How? Under the auspices of monotheism, of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which start from the proposition that there is one God in heaven or somewhere or pervading the universe, is the God of everybody, who is the origin of a single law, a single moral order that applies to us all and applies to us all equally. And in that sense, we are all, this generates a notion of the moral equality of all human beings. We're all equal in the face of the law and in the face of God. And it is a great irony to me then, because not only that this is so, but it is so poorly recognized that the key tenet of secularist political ideology is a magnificent gift of religion to human civilization. Well, in a similar way, secularism, and this gets to the point about the little book on the Reformation. There's nothing simple about this. It is a long, complicated, messy story. But the wars of religion in Europe, particularly the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, between the Protestant and Catholic powers, was violent, it was awful, it was brutal. If you want to talk about awful religious wars and the brutal modernization, that's it. That is one of the worst episodes in human history. And at the end of it, out of sheer exhaustion, particularly in the small, fragmented political world of Germany, where you have these tiny princely states, Protestant and Catholic princes in neighbouring states could no longer go on fighting one another about religion. They couldn't go on fighting one another in defence of Protestants on behalf of Catholic citizens in neighbouring Protestant princes in favour of Protestant citizens in neighbouring majority or in neighbouring Catholic states, and vice versa. It led, first of all, to the peace of the Treaty of Augsburg, I believe, with the doctrine in Latin, "Cuius regio eius religio," whoever is your ruler, that's your religion. Which was not to say, look, mate, your prince is Catholic, you're one too. What it led to the situation was a bit rather like the original meaning of Article 3 of the Malaysian Constitution. That the religion of the state, of the federation, of the public order is, meanwhile, what you do is your business. A whole process was generated out of this, which later became known as the Westphalian system, because those were the final treaties at the end of the 30 Years' War. It led to a situation that gave rise to things that a number of us still value. The recognition of individual conscience. It gave rise in the West. I don't say this is the only way, this is how it happened in the West. The notion of individual conscience, the notion of the separation between the public order and one's inner life and faith. It gave rise to the notions of individualism, of toleration and tolerance, freedom of conscience, and of secularism. Now that is the origin of it all. We can go on forever about it, but that's it. In some sense, what we call secularism, a certain, as Weber would have put it, a certain compartmentalization of the areas of life out there, and also the compartmentalization of the mind, of the human soul inside, not a total fragmentation, but a compartmentalization to say, in this area, this applies in that area, that applies in another area, there's a difference. But always with all people, there has to be an overarching, a unifying moral sensibility, or else people are nihilists and criminals. And for some people, that is still a basically or derivatively religious framework, and others not. What we call fundamentalism is simply the impulse you find in most all religions to reverse that whole process, to say we want to reunify the social world and reunify human experience, reunify the soul, and to make religion again, our religion as we understand it, the old truth, to make it the overriding, the mandatory, the governing moral order, the moral logic of society. Okay, now secular. I've come to increasingly feel that secularism is not so much a thing as an attitude. To give you the example of our good friends and neighbours and relatives across the water in Indonesia. 10, 15, 20 years or so ago, people like Gus Dur, Abdul Rahman Wahid, Nurul Majid, used to say Islamic State, no. Islamic society, Islamic social conscience, Islamic forms of social action, yes. And that, I would say, is the basis of political secularism. But nevertheless, if somebody in that world, in that situation, is an intellectual, is a philosopher, is a scientist who says, but mind you, I don't want an Islamic public political order, but as for me, the way I think through philosophical and intellectual and scientific questions is from an Islamic science standpoint, you'd have to say those people are political secularists, but intellectually or as scholars, not secularists. So secularism can be itself, just as secularism may apply across all of life or in different zones and areas of it, secularist attitudes can be then compartmentalised or specialised or focused selectively in some areas of life rather than others. Now that's, I think, all I want to say about secularism, but I don't think it's a simple thing. As with Judaism, Christianity and Islam, awful things are done in its name, but bukan salah ibu mengandung. It's not the mother's fault having given birth to this naughty child that's told to sit in the corner. Awful things have been done in the name of secularism, but nevertheless, there is a case to be made for secularism, and I don't think it's dead. And I think it's all too easy for people who know nothing about this history, nothing about philosophy, to go to some school of balaga, of Islamist rhetoric, which they're very good at, and to say, oh, well, secularism splits religion from politics, and the moment you have that, you have immoral people and immoral societies and immoral politics. That is just not a basis to enter this argument, and I think anybody who has any intellectual self-respect ought to refuse to get into any discussion about secularism on that basis. That's why I can engage with all the arguments that Dr. Heba has put today, whereas I would not engage with an argument that people just say, oh, secularism is inherently... secularism is the charter of immorality, of moral nihilism. It's not. And I can tell you all sorts of people in societies I know who live in secular societies as secular politicians whose political life, whose careers in social are deeply informed by their religious formations, background, sensibilities, but who are not simply applying what they see to be an obligatory religious worldview. The question about secularism is not whether you bring ideas of religious or any other origin to bear upon what you do, it's the question of how you do it. Now, all right, the second thing to get on to, I'm nearly finished. Yes, it's true, people say all these words, secularism, fundamentalism, the two great the twin ideas of the first university course I did in modern European history, Renaissance and Reformation. Yes, these two are all European concepts. How dare you impose that framework on us? It grows out of your history, which is not our history. And there is great merit to that argument. Fundamentalism is an inherently problematic or contestable term. Growing up, coming out of a Christian context in which people turn religion into philosophy, in reaction to which some people said, no, it's basically religion, and we want to have our religious texts and treat them seriously as religious texts and say and take them as saying what they mean, as not as what some hermeneuticist wants to find in them. Okay. All that said and done, however, one can understand how the claim, where the argument comes from, say, just because you have had a Renaissance or you have had a Reformation, you have had secularism, you have had enlightenment, you can't force us to have it, to replicate our history when we start from a different point, when you've already made the running and taken all the good turf to run on, and you're asking us to make the running under adverse conditions. Well, true, except that there's a wonderful book that came out not so long ago by an Englishman with the wonderful French name of Christopher de Bellaigue, B-E-L-L-A-I-G-U-E. There's a very good review of it, among others, in The Economist a few months ago. You can look it up. And the title of the book is The Islamic Enlightenment, The Modern Struggle Between Faith and Reason. And it is a wonderful book, because he basically says, forget all this argument saying, when will Islam ever have its enlightenment? It's long overdue. He said, it's had it already. It's done that. And the book is a study of three great cities, or it's a selective, three great cities, Cairo, Istanbul, Tehran. It's a study of 3 languages, or works and people who operated in 3 languages: Arabic, Turkish, Farsi, Iranian. It's a study of the cultures, the political communities that lived in those languages and the cultures born of them, those linguistically framed cultural life forms. And Beleg shows how a great intellectual efflorescence occurred among Muslims, by Muslims, as Muslims, in Islamic terms, in all of those 3 countries, places, cities, languages. He says, alas, it's been there, done that, it's happened. What happened? First of all, that whole process was stifled by the whole colonial era, the colonial experience, and secondly, in our own time, by the response in the Muslim world to the consequences, the experience of colonialism, namely the rise of a kind of Islam that found everything to do with enlightenment, even Islamic enlightenment, abhorrent. So I would say simply that de Beleg's book, The Islamic Enlightenment, is a book about what I would call the other, the might have been Islam of today. Aborted, suppressed and forgotten, and now even, including in countries such as this, condemned and reviled. De Beleg's book is the basis, provides the background for a heartening story of what might have been. What might have been, what people were, and now ever more insistently determined to prevent. I do not have to tell you about the banning of books. I do not have to tell you about the condemnation of secularists, modernists, freethinkers. I see there's a very nice book on sale at the table outside from Islamic Renaissance Front on sources of reformist thought. If I had to put my money down as a betting man, defying all religious orders, if I had to put my betting down on what's going to be the next book banned in Malaysia, that's the one I'd pick. Okay. Thank you very much.